As soon as Barbara gets back, she can call the meeting to order. Okay, it looks like we got Brandy.
When you get a chance, would you put a glass of water here on the stairs for me? I haven't had a bit of water, and I need some for this meeting. I'm upstairs in the bedroom. Oh, no. Tomorrow will be fine.
Oh. Hello?
Hello.
You want to call the meeting to order and ask for a motion to go into executive session?
I sure will do that. This is a meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Town of Rico. on May 27th, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. The topic of this meeting is RICO Board of Trustees Executive Session with EPA and CDPHE. I would entertain a motion to go into executive session, please.
So moved.
Second? Is there a second?
Yeah, second. Joe Croak.
All in favor?
All right.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, so do we have 4 participants or how many do we have?
We've
Oh,
actually
no.
15.
Okay. Okay, I'm just looking here. Okay, so Esteban's here and Brandy's here too now.
Yes,
Okay,
we have
okay.
we have the entire
Okay.
board except for Nicole.
Okay, so we are now in executive session, and I believe, Carrie, you wanted to take it from here and go through your outline.
Yeah, first I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and I'd like to ask you each to introduce yourself and describe your role in the EPA or the CDPHE. And I'm just going to go down this list, which sometimes jumps around. So hopefully you can help me here in case I've missed anybody. We've got, I just see a last name here. Amadigan. Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Good evening. I'm Andrea Madigan, and I'm with EPA. I'm an attorney, a Superfund attorney. I'm in the Office of Regional Counsel.
And then next we've got Doug Jamison from the EPA.
Actually, I'm with CDPHE, where
Oh,
I
I'm
manage
sorry.
the Superfund, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Manage the Superfund in the Brownfields unit.
And we have David.
Hi, yeah, my name is David Franzak, and I'm a site assessment manager with EPA and the Superfund program.
And then we've got Paul Peronard. Paul, could you please unmute and introduce yourself? Okay, we don't have Paul yet. Mark Rudolph, could you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Yes, Mark Rudolph with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and I've been working in RICO, making efforts to try to get this VCUP along, and we are here to discuss where we're at and where we're going.
And then we've got Victor Teleper. I hope I said that right.
That's pretty close. It's Victor Keteleper, and I'm with the EPA. I manage the Superfund site assessment team in Denver.
And I'm going to try again. Paul Pernard, could you please unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Looks like we lost him on there.
I feel like we just left the meeting.
Okay. And we have Samantha Caravella. Could you please unmute and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Samantha Caravello. I'm an attorney at Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell. I work with Tom Bloomfield.
And Tom, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Tom Bloomfield, attorney for the town of RICO with respect to the VCUP negotiations. Thank you, everyone.
And it looks like we got Paul Bernard back. Paul, could you please introduce yourself? Paul, could you please introduce yourself? I don't know if his computer's working. Okay.
Sorry.
We're not, you don't seem to be
So it looks like Paul's having technical
All right,
difficulties.
Yeah.
Paul is the on-scene coordinator with EPA Region 8 in the removal program. Hopefully I can read lips. So I will channel Paul if he can't find his voice.
Okay.
That's his
I can hear you. I just,
There are call-in numbers, Paul. If you have access to a phone on the invite, I believe there's phone numbers if that's more convenient.
Okay, we also have our mayor, Barbara Betts. Joe Dillsworth is a trustee. Esteban Roberts is a trustee. Joe Croak is a trustee. Brandy Randall is a trustee. Pat Fallon is a trustee, and hopefully I did not miss anybody. I'm Carrie DeStefano. I'm the town manager. And I want to, again, thank you all for joining us. I have a list of questions based on input from the RICO trustees, and they're arranged in categories. I was going to start with my written category, my written questions. And if the board members will please raise their hands when you have questions. I'd like to try to keep the questions in line with the categories. Hopefully that'll keep the discussion focused and make it a little easier to summarize the information for future reference. And so the first questions we have revolve around process. So I'm hoping that somebody can describe the process a community would take if requesting EPA involvement to remediate soil. And kind of as a follow-up to that, how would the town get listed as a Superfund site, or and then talk a little bit about that. Who has a say, how long it would take, what are the benefits, and what are the downsides? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I could start on the Superfund side of how a site becomes a Superfund site. And I think, Paul, the Superfund program really has two cleanup options. Let's say one is the removal program, which is more emergency response, short-term cleanups. And then there's also longer-term cleanups. That's what the MPL sites or the Superfund sites, and you might have heard of Bonita Peak Superfund site, for instance. That's a large, complex site. The program I represent is the site assessment program, and we look at sites to determine, if there's an environmental issue or a release of contaminants to the environment. Then, based on that data, we try to look at what are the best opportunities to address that problem. Is it, like the state voluntary cleanup, what you're looking at? Is that a good option? Is it a really hard, complex, expensive project to remediate? Those tend to go towards the NPL or the Superfund list. And or is it more of an emergency response? Was there a release? There's current exposures that are fairly high and can get done fairly quickly. Generally, it looks like 1 year time frame, under $2 million cleanup. Paul, if you joined us, do you want to add anything else about the removal program?
no, you hit it. If you guys can hear me, sorry.
Yep. You're kind of fading in a little bit, in and out. Yeah, we lost you, Paul. Oh, so how a site becomes a Superfund site, I can join in there. Is we do some evaluations of the site. We have to evaluate the site through a tool called the hazard ranking system. So then if the site qualifies, it scores high enough using the hazard ranking system tool to screen it, then it's eligible. But that doesn't mean we want to put the site on the MPL, because there might be a better, more quicker way to address the problem. We often run into issues where there's just not resources to do the work, and that's where really a lot of these sites end up going towards the national priorities list. We do, by policy, require a state letter, a state governor's letter of support before we would propose to add any sites to the national priorities list. And it's, you know, it's a fairly formal process to do that. Once a site is identified though, and is starting through that process, EPA could, at its discretion, start evaluating, doing studies to do that. I wouldn't really recommend going to the NPL on this site because I think you really know a lot about what's going on with the lead contaminated soils. You kind of know what the exposures are, and you have a cleanup approach. And you also have a party that's willing to really fund the work through a voluntary cleanup program. Is there any questions? Or?
So what would be the time frame if the EPA were to get involved? It sounds like it's a fairly drawn out process, or?
It can be, you know, it can be when, you know, when we're looking at sites, we can also do the work that Apollo does, you know, these short-term cleanups. There's high levels of contaminants that could result in an immediate risk to the environment or human health. We can also do, you know, a lot of smaller sites get done completely without ever making it to the MPL, which is, you know, that's a good thing. So I think for us to get involved, one of the things that we've been hearing, I've been hearing from the community is there might be interest in sending a citizen's petition to conduct a preliminary assessment at the EPA, and that would be the first assessment that we do to evaluate existing data and to determine if there needs to be further study or needs to be immediate action at the site. We would, you know, one of the things in Superfund law, CERCLA, is that we're required to look at other alternatives if they're available, and also look for if there's reliable parties out there that they contribute to the cleanup. I don't know if Andrea, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Carrie, you asked about the downside, the benefits on an NPL listing. It is a formal rulemaking process. So after we evaluate a site for scoring under the hazardous ranking system, we would have to propose it in formal rulemaking that gets published in the Federal Register. There's a public comment period, and then there's got to be, you know, final rulemaking after we review comments. Typically, sites are proposed for inclusion on the NPL really no more than twice a year. So, you know, it is a long process in terms of, you know, it would probably take at least a year or more for a site that's, you know, at this stage to be proposed, you know, go through the HRS process. It meets that threshold, then it would go proposed. And then, you know, you have to go through final rulemaking. So it is a pretty lengthy process. One of the big benefits is that if there's not a liable, viable party to pay to do the cleanup, federal funding can be made available to implement remedial action. Now, sites have to, there's more sites on the NPL that need money to be cleaned up than there is. So just because it's on the NPL doesn't mean it's automatically going to get funded with federal dollars. In this instance, there appears to be a liable, viable PRP, which is where we would look first to fund cleanup before we would be looking for federal dollars. So I'm not sure at this site, the NPL listing from that perspective would present much of a benefit.
What's a PRP?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll have to get out of acronym mode. It's a potentially responsible party, and under the Superfund statute, there are 4 types of parties that can be held liable for cleanup, and not only cleanup, but all response costs, investigation costs as well. So once we have a release or threat of release of a hazardous substance into the environment that EPA needs to respond to and has incurred costs, four types of parties could be held liable. First, current owners. Current owners of property. Now, there's some exceptions and some exclusions, but for the most part, current property owners can be held liable to reimburse EPA for the cleanup costs. It's not a program that is just always free. former owners and operators of the property. So if the property was formerly used in an industrial capacity and at the time that the contamination was disposed of, we can identify former owners and operators, they can held liable. Former operators, such as, Atlantic Richfield, that may have caused the contamination, or if the contamination migrated from their operations onto nearby property, can be held liable. And then generators, those that arranged for the disposal of the hazardous substances. The best example of that would be sort of a landfill. If the companies that sent waste to a landfill, if that landfill needed to be addressed, then they would be considered generators or rangers. And then the fourth category is transporters that selected the site for disposal. And typically that would be sort of transporters that acted as brokers. So if you've got a transporter or a company that goes around and picks up waste oil and says, I'll take it to a facility, and they select the site to where the waste oil goes, and that location becomes a problem, that transporter could fall into that category. So those are the four categories that we would look at in looking at liability.
So the town owning quite a bit of property in town could conceivably be held liable?
That's right. The town could potentially have liability for the costs that EPA would incur in responding. My understanding, and again, I have not evaluated the evidence, the facts, the record, but based on what I've been told, my understanding is Atlantic Richfield has liability as well. They're not really disputing that. And under the Superfund statute, liability is what we call joint and several, unless it can be apportioned. And so the liability based on, former operator liability would be pretty broad. It would be really hard to apportion the liability that a former operator under these facts would have. For current owners, it's possible that a current owner's liability would be divisible and would be limited to the geographic boundaries as opposed to all cleanup costs at the site.
So what about residential property owners or commercial property owners within the town of Rico?
Under the statute, both residential and commercial property owners have potential liability. For residential property owners, however, there is an enforcement discretion policy where EPA has, as a policy matter, has said we will not pursue residential property owners that didn't cause or contribute to the contamination. And as long as they cooperate, they provide access, and if there are institutional controls, that they comply with those institutional controls. So we typically do not, well, I've never had a case where we pursued a residential property owner, and that's based on guidance and our policy. That does not apply to owners of commercial property.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions about process or liability since we got onto that subject?
I do. If my memory serves me right, when we became initially involved in this, Rico was considered, a super fund. I had been led to believe that there are people now who believe that it wouldn't qualify for that. Is that correct?
No, the term Superfund is used kind of loosely. Sometimes it's used to really refer to a site that's on the national priorities list. And it's a Superfund site. But a site can also be considered a Superfund site when we're doing work under our removal program. So whether Rico would be eligible for listing under the hazardous ranking system, we don't know. We would have to go through the steps. It's questionable. You never know until you you look at it. In terms of our removal program, it's a different analysis to determine whether the situation would merit a removal response.
Thank you.
I have a question. My name's Joe Croak. Victor mentioned the HRS as a part of getting on the NPL using your acronyms. And I'm wondering, what are the criteria that fall under this hazard ranking system, and how do you come up with it? And what are the methods for testing that go into the hazard ranking system?
The hazard ranking system is a complex tool, and it's based on technical as well as legal issues. The simple way to explain it is it really looks for source areas of contamination and how much source of contamination is out there. And it uses methods to calculate sources based on whether it's something that's found in soil, is it dispersed through air, is it found in the water. So we look at, there's different pathways. So we look at the source area, we look at the pathway, which means how does the source migrate to impacting someone or the environment? Is it through the air? Is it through water? Is it through underground water movement? And then it looks at who's getting impacted. And it depends on the toxicity of the contaminant, the number of people that are being exposed, and if they're directly being exposed or secondarily being exposed. So all those factors go through this analysis, and we come up with a site score, which the score comes somewhere between 0 and 100. And if the site scores between 23.5, then it's eligible to be placed on the National Priorities List, or NPL.
And does it take into consideration, Victor, the future population base, i.e. children, unborn children? Are people part of the factoring in this?
It's really looking at the current population.
Current population.
So people are factored. For instance, let's say we have contaminated groundwater, people are using private wells, we would look at the number of households or the number of people that were drinking that contaminated water or have the potential of drinking that water in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, it's these kinds of sites, these lead soil sites, we see them often eligible for the NPL. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the right approach, but it is it's an approach that works for a lot of communities.
So what would you consider to be the downside?
I think on this site in particular, you've made a lot of progress. It seems like you're close to, what I hear, rumors at least, that you're close to some sort of cleanup through the voluntary cleanup program. And if all the parties agree and the state approves the plan, I think work can proceed pretty quickly. I think the downside is that it is going through the NPL process is lengthy. It does do a very thorough job of evaluating sites. It does provide for the cleanup of the site, and it also provides for long-term maintenance. In some cases, particularly these lead soil type sites, there's some sort of what we call institutional controls and program management to make sure that if not all the waste has been removed, there's documentation of where that waste is, and if someone is going to be doing some construction work that might uncover that waste or get into that waste, there's procedures in place. And typically a local government or county or something like that oversees that work. The state is usually heavily involved in that as well, as they're required to be heavily involved in the long-term maintenance of the cleanup.
I would just add also that, sites on the NPL, the big benefit in my view is that typically there's sites that present really complex environmental issues. where it really requires a lot of study and analysis, and where you really want to consider all the alternatives and look at the different options in terms of a remedy. You know, every remedy has its upside and downside. You know, there's short-term inconveniences, you know, long-term problems, and what the sites on the national priorities list does is there's a really formal process that's pretty thorough, pretty thoughtful, but it can be lengthy. And so, you know, you always want to pick the right tool for the job. And so the question to ask the town is, you know, is the complexity presented by the soils contamination, is that really the right tool? Because it's going to come with a higher price tag, and it's going to come with a longer timeline. You know, so is it really the right tool? And it is in many instances. You know, a lot of mining sites where there's very challenging groundwater issues and mine pools and draining adits, and you know, we really rely on that lengthy methodical evaluation.
And I was going to add, Andrea, too, is the sites that I see going towards the NPL sites are very costly sites, that there's no real deep pocket out there or any other funding source to address the problem. So it's complexity and cost, I think.
Which leads me to a question, Andrea, in terms of joint and several liability, is the consideration taken as to the source of payment for this? I mean, in this case, there's a very, very able source of payment for the reclamation. And then there's the town and people in town who are not. So given that and the degree of responsibility as it's passed down through ownership, as you say, current owners, former owners, et cetera, at the top of the list is the biggest monkey in the room, so to speak. So I would guess that that's where it would all fall.
So you're right that typically, you know, we would work with the you know, a corporate PRP that was financially viable to address the problem, particularly when that PRP would have joint and several liability. However, it's important to realize that if we were to, even when we enter into, say, when there's multiple PRPs, potentially responsible parties, I'm going to try not to use too many acronyms tonight. Okay. When there are multiple liable parties, and we enter into an agreement with one, under the Superfund statute, that party, that PRP, has contribution claims against the other potentially responsible parties. So if we, you know, and that's based on a fair share. So in this instance, you know, if we were to enter into an agreement with the major former operator, and they did all of the work, they don't necessarily would, but have the illegal, would have a legal claim against other potentially responsible parties. Whether they would pursue that or not is a question. I can tell you that I haven't seen that in many other sites, but I do think it's important to realize that they would have that type of claim.
So they could go after the town as a big landowner, right?
Right. Now in those, you know, there's also settlement tools that we have. When we're dealing in a situation where you have a town, you know, there's ways that we could enter into settlements with local government agencies for in-kind services. So it's not, you know, we've done settlements where we've looked to, you know, the local government to support our work by taking on, you know, a part of the work that would be very cost effective for the town, working with us with institutional controls. There's ways to resolve that liability. And when we enter into settlements with parties, they get what's called contribution protection. That means that no other potentially responsible party can then seek more from the party with whom we've settled.
Thank you. Does anybody else?
I was just gonna say, it gets really complicated and it's kind of hard to lay it out in the abstract. So
Right. Does anybody else have any questions about this process? I'm not hearing anybody. So I'd just like to move on and ask you briefly to describe the risk analysis you undertake. Because there have been a lot of questions in town about how the CDPHE and in the prior VCUP, the original VCUP agreement, how the CDPHE and ARCO arrived at the 1,100 parts per million for residential uses and the 1,700 parts per million for other than residential, because there's a website, the CDC government site, that states the EPA standard for lead in bare soil play areas is 400 parts per million by weight and 1,200 parts per million for non-play areas. So, and then it goes on to say this regulation applies to cleanup projects using federal funds. So could you please talk a little bit about how you arrive at your remediation levels?
Sure, I think it's probably a similar process, but those numbers that you discussed, those are identified as screening level numbers. 400 parts per million lead in soil, purchase screening level for residential exposures. What that means is that concentrations below that would provide very little risk or no risk of concern. Concentrations above that might pose a risk. Our risk assessors would evaluate the site and develop cleanup goals based on site conditions. It could be how bioavailable the lead is. That means if it is ingested, how does the body uptake it? It could include how many days a year people might be exposed to the soil. In a town like Rico, where you have snow cover part of the year and it's cold, maybe that exposure might only be 3 or 4 or 5 months during the warmer years part of the year versus the colder parts of the year when the ground is frozen or there's snow cover and kids aren't playing out in it. So all those kinds of factors play into a risk assessment that comes up with a site-specific cleanup level. And those can vary significantly depending on what the site conditions are.
So we've also been told that between the time we had a risk analysis done in 2006 and now that the baseline screening for screening level in blood dropped from 10 micrograms per deciliter to 5 micrograms per deciliter. If you were to reevaluate this site, would you, I'm assuming you would take that into consideration, or would you depend on the work that had been done prior to, in our prior risk assessment?
Yeah, EPA, if we were to start getting involved now, we would use what the current standards are for blood lead concentrations. So that would be, a lower goal than probably what was looked at, 15 years ago.
Do any of the other trustees, I know there's been a lot of questions from all of you about this. Does anybody else want to jump here and ask any questions about the way they do their risk assessment?
I think, Carrie, you took a lot of the words out of my mouth and probably placed them together better than I could have. So my questions have been getting answered pretty well. And, I'm taking a lot of notes here.
Brandy, do you have any questions about that? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I was just wondering if that, Victor, what you just told us, so if, for example, we had snow coverage part-time of the year, if that's what would validate us accepting an action level at like 1,200, and just that there would, in theory, be less exposure over time, or if us accepting a higher action level is kind of just us kind of meeting in a middle ground for an agreement. Because I think most of our community has been concerned about those numbers specifically, and we were looking for some more kind of scientific validation as to why we would agree to these levels.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, those factors would result in a higher cleanup goal. I think, what I understand of what was done before would follow the same kind of model that they use to evaluate, how much lead is in the soil that would result into a certain blood lead level that would, establish that cleanup goal. I don't know. We would probably, as EPA, starting at this point, we would reevaluate, the risk. I think you would have to, I think for someone to be comfortable with that is really to have a third party evaluation of what the work was done. I don't know if the state would do, I don't know what, I'm not familiar with the state voluntary cleanup program, maybe Doug or Mark.
Victor, this is Doug Jamison. I'll jump in really quick. The state does have the ability to do a health consult that would follow a process very similar to the process EPA's if the town, wanted to go that route through the voluntary cleanup program. And we could basically update the process. Back in 2006, my understanding was they even brought in EPA staff to go through the same process EPA would today with that higher number. And so that's how they arrived at the 1,200, going through the exact same process EPA would today, but with a higher target blood lead level. So we could do something similar without going through the whole Superfund national priority list through a health consult. But again, these are some of the factors that need to be weighed.
Thank you.
I
Let me just provide a little more background. The one of the key factors, I think, in the risk assessment here had to do with the bioavailability of the lead. The 400 parts per million number, it assumes, for example, there's lead paint, and the lead paint the type of lead in lead paint is very bioavailable, meaning a small amount gets in, you consume a certain amount and a high percentage can get into your blood, relative to mining lead that's kind of tied up with the mineral. So if you're exposed to this type of lead that exists in RICO from mining, you're not going to, even if you consume it or touch it, a very little of it is going to get into your blood. And so that was part of the factor in the analysis that was prepared by ARCO's consultant that the state reviewed and that EPA reviewed back in 2006 or so. And then we did have a independent third party did review that work as well. Geosyntec had their health experts review it as well. But clearly there's new information, the new blood level. So I think this is something that needs to be looked at. But I wanted to clarify that it wasn't just a negotiation that we're compromising between two numbers. It was really a science-based number that was put together based on EPA risk protocols.
I understand. Just from the community health perspective, when people come asking us questions, is it more is the fact that we have snow coverage part of the year more important, or is it just the bioavailability? And it sounds like it's more like the bioavailability.
I think they are all important factors that go into a risk evaluation. Every site is a little different, and
right.
Bioavailability can vary based on ore type.
Given what you've said, Tom, this is Joe Croak again. you know, I understand that the sources of lead, there's, you know, sources from drinking water, paint, and industrial emissions, et cetera. But a study I've seen by Klassen says that oral and inhalation routes are the most common form of exposure. And hand-to-mouth activities of children are a route for dermal and oral exposures. Approximately 90% of lead particles deposited in the lungs are from ambient air or small enough to be absorbed. What that says to me is not without regard to the season, snow cover, et cetera, that the wind is the primary method that lead is transmitted in this town off of streets and off of surface lead contaminated soils. And it's so small and particulate that it's absorbed through people's lungs. And in the case of kids, through their hands in touching the dirt. So I don't buy this part of it. I think that the contamination levels and the site assessment and risk analysis needs to be much more in depth than what ARCO has proposed, what CDPHE has proposed, and we need to get down to a level that really is in line. And a lot of this stuff, just so you know, I've gleaned from reading Stacy Berry's doctoral thesis at Butte, wherein she has quite a bit of this kind of information. And it involves EPA, ARCO, incidentally. Question being is, are you going to come back in and test? And how are you going to test? And where are you going to test?
Does anybody
This
have
is-
an answer?
Yeah, this is Mark Rudolph. I wanted to add a couple things in and highlighting off of what Doug had said. So, you know, all of those components, bioavailability, you know, amount of snow cover a year, areas of access, you know, a hillside where there's a mineralized outcrop could have really high lead. But it might not be mobile or be able to have somebody be exposed to it unless they were, you know, climbing up that cliff face. All of that being said, all of those components were done in that, were accounted for in that 2006. The unfortunate thing is the blood lead screening reference was at a higher number than it is right now. So I just wanted to relay that on, that all of these components were assessed in the previous risk assessment, that there was an EPA staff toxicologist, Susan, I forget what Susan's last name was, and then our toxicologist, Raj Goyal, were both working on that and had come to agreement along with the town of Rico's hired risk assessor, and then Atlantic Richfield's hired risk assessor. And all four of those risk assessment groups working individually had come to those numbers. Granted, that was prior at the 10 milligrams per deciliter for the blood reference dose at that point in time.
So just to clarify, the process that that was gone through for the 2006 risk assessment would be similar. It would be a similar model. It would just be replacing these the 10 deciliter or micrograms per deciliter with the 5 micrograms per deciliter. Is that correct?
It would either be that, or it'd be rerunning calculations and reviewing the data that was all input into the model that was previously done. It would be one or the other. And me not being a risk assessor, I can't answer for what their process would be, but it'll be one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
Victor,
kind
the
of
EPA does the same type of process?
Yes, the EPA would do a similar type process, and Susan Griffin that reviewed that risk assessment was one of our national risk assessment leaders in lead exposure. She's now retired, but you know, you had one of the best review it. from EPA's standpoint.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I guess my other question is, as far as the process goes, in what we've done with ARCO, have we sort of used the EPA's model in what we're doing, or is that a model that we could adopt? I know we're already pretty far into this kind of agreement, but for just kind of to compare, is that model kind of offered up as an example for situations like this to sort of be able to reference and use?
You're
Cindy, would
talking
that be-
about,
Go ahead, Victor.
I was wondering if you're talking about the lead risk assessment model?
No, kind of more like the cleanup process.
Process. I think, Mark, you can explain what the voluntary cleanup program does and how they do work. We have the two options really under Superfund, which is if it turns out that there's high risk and a project can be done fairly quickly, or even a longer term project where we need to address high risk, we can do that fairly quickly. But we EPA have to make that evaluation, and we have lots of priorities, so we have to determine where do we spend our money to address the highest risk. Sort of a triage type approach, I'd say, on the emergency response level.
So with this site, we started off with identifying by sampling, identifying areas of contamination. At the same time, we were going through the risk assessment process, and from that, the cleanup number was developed, and properties continued to be sampled and identified for whether the presence of contamination or non-contamination on the property. And some properties had been cleaned up at the earlier stages where access was granted. And then we kind of hit a roadblock, and we were moving down the avenue to establish the institutional controls, which is the whole process of the town ordinance that I think you all are aware of. And funding agreements and all of that. And the previous town board, I think it would have been 2010, said it was taking too long, didn't want to participate in it any longer. And so here we are back now with an interest in developing properties, wanting to get properties cleaned up, reigniting the interest with the town and Atlantic Richfield to come back to the table, to come to agreements on long-term funding agreements, as well as finalizing the institutional control, which is the form of the town ordinance. Based off of what I said, Victor or Andrea or whomever at EPA, would you see that would be a similar process, or would you go around a different avenue?
It would be a little bit different, with ultimately the result looking similar, in the sense that it might take longer under the removal program. We would seek to enter into an order on consent with Atlantic Richfield, where our removal program would oversee the work. And they'd have to do a work plan and select the appropriate response. We would also look for some sort of follow-up when waste is left in place. My understanding is that you'd probably be digging down a certain level, clean, and then putting clean fill in areas. Is that, it's kind of a meat and potatoes kind of remedy, right? You haul the stuff out, you put it in the repository, you put clean stuff in, but below a certain level, there's going to still be contamination that could be encountered if somebody wants to put in a swimming pool or a basketball pole or something. And you'd want to make sure that future property owners knew that if they went down below another level, that they may be encountering material. And we rely frequently on the same environmental covenant statute that Colorado relies upon as an institutional control. It's a really good tool in our view in making sure that future property owners know what they got and that they're protected, so that if they make changes, that they're not unwittingly encountering contaminated soil below a certain level. And the ordinance that is provided for under Colorado statute is pretty effective. And so, you know, it would be something that we would be looking at as well.
Yeah, Andrea, I think that's an important point. No matter what route we go, whether it would be national priorities list, removal, voluntary cleanup, you know, I anticipate there would be a long-term management strategy, a city ordinance or a town ordinance that would do the sorts of things Andrea was just discussing, that would, you know, educate people that even though there's been cleanup done, there's a potential in areas for you to encounter contaminated soil, and recommending or mandating steps that people would have to do certain activities. Like if you're excavating below a certain depth where cleanup occurred, you would have to do X, Y, Z.
You know, the other thing that I've seen at other sites is that, you know, in the residential areas, sometimes there's lead paint issues, and unless the lead paint is flaking off and is in the environment, the Superfund program can't address that. But we sometimes try to partner with other programs to make sure that homeowners know about lead paint abatement and the sorts of things that they can do to keep their families safe if they're dealing with, you know, with that issue.
So I have a question about that. I was looking at some other remediation projects, one in Central City and one in the city of Aspen. And like you said, both towns adopted ordinances that regulated the use of those properties going forward. So my question is the funding from the EPA to help small towns? We don't have many resources. Implement that type of ordinance. And the other question about that would be how much CDPHE oversight or EPA oversight would there be with people that wanted to engage in development activities on those sites?
So just to note that, you know, both Central City and Aspen, you know, those cleanups were done 80s, 90s, and it was even before, you know, long before Colorado adopted its environmental covenant statute, which is a much more, you know, streamlined and pretty amazing, you know, statute, and the website and the information that's available about properties, and to provide for transparency and for people to know what's going on is, you know, we've advanced, you know, pretty significantly since those days. But in any event, in the EPA world, in their Superfund world, you know, because there appears to be a liable, viable PRP, the goal would be to have that party pay for and fund that program. And my understanding that they're offering to do that under the VCUP as well. Now, I've worked on a lot of sites where, you know, there's no former operator around, and it's really the property owners in the town that are left, you know, to figure this out. So I know how stressful this all is, but there are things here that are, you know, the town is there's a much better outcome in store, you know, given what we've got on the facts presented here.
And Andrea, I'll add the typical process where Leadville's a good example. We have several ordinances in place by Lake County and Leadville. And the process is when they come in to get a building permit, if it's one of the property that falls under the ordinance, they have to communicate with CDPHE, and we provide a letter that says their plan, they presented a plan to us, we agree with it, or they don't need a plan, and they can move forward with that. And, so there's typically, except through the mechanism that Andrea discussed, and I know that in Kellogg, Idaho, the PRP there funds some of the local staff that do the same sorts of work that we're talking about here, manage and implement these long-term controls. So it's a possibility in that regard. But if that was not the case, we could draft an ordinance or prepare an ordinance that would shift a lot of the burden to the state and would fall within the town's normal processes, and we would hope it wouldn't be too much of a burden on the town.
And to add on, what Doug described for the Leadville ordinance is pretty much the same as what we did in San Juan County for the Bonita Peak Superfund site. And it's very similar to what's being proposed at Enrico with the building permit, which is what kicks in whether the site needs to have any oversight from the state, or in this case for the town of Rico, it would be the environmental consultant paid for by Atlantic Richfield to help devise the cleanup plan, disposal of the material up to the repository, et cetera.
Right. That is a huge benefit, is there's a location where, any soil that was addressed under a long-term protectiveness strategy there's a place for it to go. Not all places have that.
Right. So if the EPA were involved, would that repository that's permitted right now at the St. Louis Tunnel, would that be available to the town?
We would have to work that out with Atlantic Richfield. I would hope so.
Carrie, it is currently, and it will remain available to the town. It was designed and permitted through Dolores County for residential soils. There's a second repository that's up there that's permitted strictly for water treatment sludges. But yeah, there is a residential soils landfill repository up at by the St. Louis Tunnel.
Would that, Curtis, or would that be extended to, say, excavations the town might undertake to put in a sewer or replace water lines or any other kind of utility?
That would come out to capacity and space. I know that Atlantic Richfield has indicated that they would like to, that they have plans based off of capacity to be able to have create an additional repository for future contaminated waste if they met capacity at the current repository.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions before? I have some questions about sampling, but before we go on to that, are there any other questions from the board?
Yeah, I have a question about what happens after, if the EPA enforces the cleanup, and lots are being developed. I mean, I would assume the town is on the hook for, funding those incremental costs. And also, if the EPA was to enforce, cleanup, I mean, after the EPA left, would we still have access to the repository?
There's a lot of details that, we just don't really know until we work those out with the responsible party. So, I mean, those are things that would make sense to obtain. And, some sites, there's been kind of a trust fund set up that allows, that provides money for those kinds of long-term activities. Other sites, it's been more of a, pay-as-you-go kind of approach. But it's hard to really determine what exactly an agreement would look like sometime.
I'll add, again, in Leadville as an example, there is a repository available, and a developer came in to create residential units on a larger property. So we allowed that developer to take contaminated soil from the development site to the repository. Again, it was through the building permit process that we had established through the ordinance that Leadville and Lake County passed. So, there's you never know until you get kind of the details worked out, but there are certainly strategies, and we certainly, try to reduce the burden on the town any way that we can.
So in Leadville, did the developer then pay for the cleanup in that case?
The developer paid for the cleanup. He saved a lot of money in disposal costs, of course, because he was able to do a landfill that was about 1.5 miles away from the development site. But yes.
So does anybody have any questions before we move on to sampling?
I'd like to just say, like, one of the reasons we're here is basically for a second opinion. Right now, we're working off of the same opinion we've had. As an elected official, it's hard to sell to the people in town that the levels that are extremely higher than what, this is a very hard subject to research for people. And when they start to research it, they find that 400 parts per million number, and they can't get far beyond that. So it's hard for me as an elected official to sell anything more than that to people. And I think one of the reasons we're here is to have another opinion. So if we were to have, say, an opinion from the EPA, that would not be an EPA takeover. Is there a way we can simply have an opinion from the EPA saying what we've been trying to negotiate is absolutely good and correct, and people should feel safe with that, and then eliminate the EPA in the end and continue with the V Cup?
So, we discussed that quite a bit in preparation for, this meeting tonight. And, I can sort of report out what are the comments that we had. NPL, I think is, probably not real viable, given the length of the process, how far the site has come. And to me, it would be, you'd be starting over with not any real assurance that it would get ranked. To me, that is, you'd be backtracking, and you may end up stuck. So that would leave the removal program. And I think our informal consensus was that we would encourage you to stick to see the voluntary process through. You're so close, and the removal program, one of the elements is, in order to invoke that authority, is that there aren't other programs that can address the problem. And that's in our national contingency plan, in our regulations. And it seems that the cleanups would be very similar, and you'd be backtracking as well. Now, I can't really speak to the risk assessment, and it seems like there's a lot of confusion or uncertainty about that. And maybe the way to go is to provide just more clear information about the cleanup level and how that fits in, because it seems to me that's where people are concerned, and what the picture is. I don't think it would look very different if EPA did it, from what I know. And again, I'm not a technical person, but it seems like you'd be backtracking and you would with EPA coming in the removal program, you'd be backtracking. You'd end up at the same place, but it would take longer. That's my gut.
I agree with that too. I think it also makes sense that you, as a town, would request the risk assessment to be updated.
Yeah. I think that's certainly a conversation that seems appropriate. Does it make sense to update the risk assessment? Because things have changed. The science has changed. The inputs into the models have changed a little bit. So that's certainly a conversation worth having, and see if that's something that should be pursued, and what it would take to do that.
And that has been requested of Atlantic Richfield to start off, instead of redoing the risk assessment, I requested that they rerun the numbers with the current blood lead levels. In my conversation with Brian Johnson at Atlantic Richfield last week, they said that they did do that, but they can't release those numbers. They're still being reviewed. And I think that it would probably be the town board requesting that they provide that updated risk assessment calculations. And maybe at that point in time, that second opinion, Pat, that you were looking for could come from a CDPHE risk assessor, as well as maybe some minimal time from an EPA risk assessor, even though Susan Griffin had done that originally in 2006. Maybe that would be sufficient information for you all.
It would seem important that our second opinion came from someone other than the person who gave us our first opinion, if that makes sense.
That was BP?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. I think that's the voluntary cleanup program has that built into it. So, and I think we could also, I don't know, our risk assessors are pretty busy, but they always can request some support from EPA as well.
I see a hand raised.
Did you have a question, Barbara?
Well, I have a comment, and that is that there is a level of disbelief, untrustworthiness, all of those things among the citizens here. And they want to make sure that what we do is fair to them and fair to this community, and that we have addressed the things have changed, and who do we go to assure the town that these are the appropriate levels, and and how do we show them that those are met? Because they have heard these numbers now, and a lot of people are saying, I won't accept anything but 400 parts per million. Well, they don't know. I mean, we have to rely on others to know but when information like this gets out and it's publicly available, then people become pretty excited about it and want to make sure that they are not getting short shrift in this. And we want to be able to have the information to assure them that that is not happening.
And that's definitely very challenging to be able to communicate risk, because it's somewhat abstract.
Yeah.
So I have some questions about sampling. Over the course of the years, there's been a lot of sampling done in town, but not of all the properties in town. If the EPA were to undertake this project, would the sampling be not only of the lots in the middle of the town, but also in those mining claims that are kind of scattered around the hillside that are also part of the municipal boundary or within the municipal boundary? How does your sample process work? Better way to say that.
Andrea, let me take that just based on our experience in Pueblo right now, where we have a residential lead cleanup site. It's smelter derived contamination rather than more mineral processing, as I think we have in Rico. So we are only sampling residential properties, and that is restricted. Now, there's subsequent phases that will look at commercial properties, but I'm presuming for this, this is a residential cleanup plan, so we would limit those to existing residential lots. Again, the long-term management strategy would be crafted to address future lots that were not residential today, or any zoning changes, so to ensure that those consistent cleanup levels were applied when a property was newly used as a residential property. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions about sampling? Considering a lot of these samples are older, would you redo any of them?
Well, I wish Paul was on because he could explain this so much better, the way the removal program would go about doing that. There's an efficiency of, how much sampling do you do, and when do you start actually removing contaminated soil, and can you couple that so that you're not, missing a construction season? Can you sample and clean up as you go? Those are the sorts of things that get worked into the on-scene coordinators and how they manage a project. So Paul would be better to speak to that. The question is, where are the edges? Where do you stop? That becomes the challenge, and that's really where the cleanup level really plays in, because if you're going to just dig down 18 to 24 inches, you're not going to go much further than that. Doesn't really matter what's at the bottom of that, because everything on the top is going to be clean, right? But where do you stop? How far do you go out? That's where the more challenging decisions have to be made. And that's where I guess the risk assessment and the cleanup levels would come in.
Does anybody else have any questions about sampling?
I guess I'd like to know how areas are determined as, there's residential, there's play areas. If the EPA were to come in, would there be different consideration given our lifestyles, being very outdoorsy people, having dirt streets? I think the biggest thing for people is people know that, if you look at historic pictures of the area, the mountainsides are littered with tailings piles, predominantly lead, zinc, whatever else is coming out of there. Now, a majority of those tailings piles were disposed of, being used as road base and backfill for water lines. It's what our streets are built of. We play on these streets, our dogs, our kids. It's the most ingested, I believe, contamination in town comes from the streets. Now, it's easy for ARCO to say, well, the streets only get cleaned up to 1,700. Would the EPA have a different understanding based on our unique situation that the streets are probably more play area than any of our yards are?
The EPA risk assessment process would look at, those kinds of factors. I've done risk assessment work where we've looked at exposures from people riding dirt bikes, for instance, and what kind of exposures people get from that.
Little kids are close to the ground there, and they're picking stuff up and all. I see mothers constantly walking their baby stroller a foot and a half off the ground. The wind comes by and picking that. What we know is mine tailings blowing right off the street into the baby strollers. I was told at a previous meeting that I should be more concerned of the paint chips that might have fell off the side of my house than I should be with my kids on the street out there inhaling that dust, which, like I said, it's hard to sell to people that could possibly be true.
It also depends how much time they're spending, being exposed in the street versus lead paint is more absorbable by the human body, that lead in there. But if you're getting exposed more in the street, that might be the greatest exposure pathway. It's until you really study it, it's hard to say which is which. I was thinking that sites, maybe Doug might know. I'm thinking that in some sites where we've had alleyways and stuff, we've looked at the residential standard, not the commercial standard in alleyways. But Doug, do you recall any experience on that? I was thinking of Vasquez Boulevard site.
You know, the most recent one was Colorado Smelter in Pueblo, and they did use a different exposure scenario for alleyways. And they found that alleys were not an issue. And the citizens, some of the citizens don't like that. You know, and so we're trying to do things with the town to address citizen concerns about alleyways, but Superfund decided that the alleyways did not need cleanup.
I guess part of it too is until we really, you know, until we would get involved and start doing the data and looking at all this, it's hard to answer some of the questions, you know, as to what the decisions would be. So.
No, and I understand that, which I guess brings me back to my first question is, what are the possibilities of the EPA simply giving us a second opinion on a risk analysis and what areas should be treated as such?
I don't think that there's a mechanism for EPA to come in and just do a separate risk assessment. You know, what we could certainly, you know, support CDPHE in you know, redoing it based on what they've got and working with ARCO, but we don't do a risk assessment without first you know, collecting a lot of data, collecting a lot of information, and again, you'd be taking a step back. And if that's what you're asking for us to do a new risk assessment, you know,
it seems like a risk assessment would be essential to providing a second opinion. I mean, I don't see how it could be done any other way. So, I mean, essentially, we're saying that even if what we end up negotiating turns out to ultimately be hazardous to people's health, it's the best we're going to do, and we should just accept it, is what I'm getting, I guess.
Well, let me throw out a couple scenarios. First is that ARCO BP agrees to update the work that was done previously. You know, in that scenario, I think we could get CDPHE and EPA toxicologists to review that report and make sure that, you know, they run the model the way it should be, that they've included all the factors, the correct exposure, you know, baselines, all those things. So I think that's quite possible. That should be pretty easy. The other thing is the health consult I mentioned easier. That's kind of a mini risk assessment. It doesn't go quite into as depth, but it does go through very similar protocols and can come up with a number. And that would be, you know, again, I'd have to consult with our toxicology people, but I believe that they have funding to do those sorts of things when they're requested. And that's done separately from EPA, and that's done with funding from ATSDR. So those are a couple of scenarios where you might be able to get that second opinion you're looking for.
What is ATSDR?
I'm sorry, I knew it as soon as I said it, it's the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease
Registry.
It's part of the CDC.
We
all know CDC these days.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? I have a couple about the remediation action. What we're being told with the last VCUP that was negotiated in the current is the typical remediation action constitutes removing a foot of the contaminated soil, putting down a geotech marker, and then replacing that soil with, or putting clean soil on the geotech marker. Is that sort of the standard protocol with respect to remediation?
It depends a little bit on the type of contamination. And again, I'll go back to Leadville because I worked on Leadville for many, many years. We did not put in the marker because we found that the contamination was limited in 99.9% of the properties to the first 6 inches. And once you got below a foot, it disappeared entirely. And that was mostly because the contamination was smelter deposition rather than scattering of mine tailings or waste rock. At Colorado Smelter, that's the exact process. In Pueblo, that's the exact process we use. We dig down to 18 inches or 24 in, like if there's a play area, we'll go a little deeper if there's a play area. Sample, and if there's contamination remaining, we'll put down that marker so people don't dig below without knowing that it has to be managed. And so that is a pretty common cleanup strategy, is to, you're trying to prevent exposures in those areas that are used most frequently.
So if the EPA was gonna do a cleanup in a residential area, it would be mainly, and it would be on people's lots. It wouldn't be in any of the open space areas or any of the big mining claims.
So again, it would depend, you can't answer these questions without doing an investigation and whatnot. But I think that's not an unreasonable assumption.
Yeah, I mean, I think we might look at those areas as potential to recontaminate the areas that have been cleaned up, but
the EPA could look at ballparks or community areas as part of that, and they typically do so at other lead cleanup sites.
Yep, as well as alleyways and streets. And
how about previously reclaimed brownfield sites?
I mean, if there's documentation that the cleanup work's been done.
Well, I'm speaking, in particular, the Pro Patria mill site, for example, has been capped, remediated. That was done, I don't know, 2000 maybe. It still emits mine waste water into the streets. Could we go back into those previously remediated sites, retest those, and get them reclaimed again? Is that part of a negotiation we have with BP when we do actually get to the point where we're negotiating the nuts and bolts of ECUP? Because what I gather from listening to all this is that it's probably preferable for us to keep going forward rather than going backwards a couple of steps with the EPA. And so it needs to be sort of an omnibus agreement that we need to have here that includes everything. And we're talking about streets and parks and residential properties, et cetera. And it may include, as Victor said, the establishment of a trust for the benefit of the citizens of RICO going forward for the future remediation and deposit of toxic soils. But I'm looking at specific sites in RICO, and I think it alludes to what Pat said about getting a third party here to test. And it may not, if it includes the EPA, it means you guys have to come in here and go through the process of Superfund or the beginnings of Superfund. It probably doesn't make sense, but maybe it means that we need to talk to BP about funding an independent third-party testing group to come and look at all this property to facilitate this whole negotiation. If any of that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's kind of the double-edged sword of mining areas. These communities were built on mining, and there's mining waste everywhere. And so, as Andrea has said over and over again tonight, it's really about how do you evaluate risk from all these different sources or potential sources. And obviously, there's a lot of focus on residential properties because that's where the greatest likelihood of exposure is. And so again, what the town negotiates with BP, I think BP will, if they agree that this is a potential exposure point, then hopefully that you guys could come to terms on things like this. I think that we're all in agreement that it makes a lot of sense to do as much as we can with residential properties through one process or another. And we're sitting here debating what's the best process for that.
Yeah.
And that said, then how do we get to the next step? And it's been suggested by one board member that a mediation may be something that we pursue. But to get to a mediation where the town is able to present its case in terms of contamination levels, you know, the continuing exposure to the broader spectrum, which are open adits and water contamination, et cetera. We need to have some sort of expert testimony, if you will, to back that negotiation, were it to be mediated or otherwise. And I know probably Tom's been involved in that, but I'm just trying to figure out how to get this going forward quickly, but fairly.
I guess I would just, in my experience, it's a process in mine sites where if you try to say, I'm not going to start until I've got everything taken care of and I know what the end is going to be, sometimes you never start. And, you know, residential properties, they're contaminated, the levels are high, something's got to happen, and it should happen quickly. It should happen soon, because every day people in your community they're being exposed in their homes, in their properties. And I agree, you know, draining adits, they present issues, they present ecological risk, but we prioritize human health risk. And so you can keep those things on your list, but I would encourage all of us to say, let's get started with the highest risk as quickly as possible. You know, get started this construction season. Stuff could start happening this construction season. And it doesn't, the thing I like, the other thing I like about the voluntary cleanup program is there's more flexibility in terms of expanding as needed, you know, and it's not as, there's not as many administrative requirements. And so I would just encourage you to really think about, you know, prioritizing, addressing the worst stuff first, as quickly as possible, not cutting off the ability to add as you go along. And I think, you know, this isn't, you know, as Doug mentioned, you know, we've seen this in other mining communities as well. And certainly understand the concern, the frustration, the fear. The goal is to get started on the ground.
I think the people's concerns with that, I mean, to get anything started is going to begin with negotiation to release the PRP's liability in the end. And if we agree to something that still leaves us with this issue, it seems to people, what's the point?
Well, it doesn't, EPA is the safety net there, because EPA under the voluntary cleanup program, well, I guess perhaps there would be an enforcement bar if there were problems, right? So there's some liability protection under the voluntary cleanup program, but not complete. So we can look at that.
Yeah, and I think part of that has to do with the scope, right? I mean, this is a lead soils cleanup. This is not a groundwater cleanup. This is not a water cleanup. And so any release that would occur, release of liability, if there is such a thing here, that it wouldn't include water. In addition, you know, I think wanted to go back and I don't know what the right moment is to pick this up, but I think one of the things you said, Joe, was going back and doing a lot more sampling or getting a third party to do independent sampling. And I wanted to make sure that, I think it was Doug who was responding, you know, when you were agreeing, just wanted to be clear, is the suggestion from the regulatory folks that, you know, ARCO's gone out and done a lot of sampling using third party consultants, that they've used, you know, in lots of different places. Is that data that EPA would be relying upon? Generally, when it's going out and overseeing a PRP to do work, does EPA feel a need to go out and collect all of its own samples? Or are they typically relying on samples collected by the PRP under the oversight of the agency? And really the question is, there's been some questions raised about, we have many years of data that have been collected. People are, these days wondering, well, can we trust that data? ARCO's a company, is the consultant they hired, are they faking the data? Is it bad data? Do we need to have our own consultant go out and do the sampling? Is that something that you think is a significant concern? Obviously, you don't know specifically with this data. You haven't studied the data here. I'm not asking that question, but as a general matter, what kind of data is EPA relying on when it's doing analysis, when it's overseeing PRP's work?
Well, there's two aspects to that. It's first, when we're selecting the remedy, we have to select the remedy, and we would have to evaluate what data we have, what data is out there, evaluate the circumstances under which it was collected, but then at least do some confirmatory work. I mean, I don't think we ever take anything at face value, but we wouldn't go out and redo everything if we felt there was a certain level of credibility, right? But then when a PRP or potentially responsible party implements a cleanup, there is oversight. There's a sampling plan, quality assurance plan, health and safety plan, a SAP, a QAPA, too many acronyms, so, the oversight, there's labs that they have to take it to a lab that's been certified. EPA has access to the lab. There's split samples. There's, there is a fairly rigorous level of oversight once the work gets underway.
Okay, so for a very simple example, in the 06 blood sampling, which CDPHE has already addressed tonight, they have data, they're reviewing it, they haven't released it for one reason or another. Maybe it's HIPAA, I don't know what it is. But if you take that data as it's been reevaluated and then apply it to new blood sampling data, for instance, and there's no noticeable difference, then the conclusion I would draw, the uneducated conclusion I would draw, would be that there is no known greater contamination now than there was in 06. Similarly, by soil sampling in town to a greater degree and on a broader scale compared to the sampling that was done back then, we would know whether that sampling was adequate, mediocre, or just poor. So I'm just looking for a way, and I agree with you that going backwards to get to where we want to go is not a good idea. I think what we're trying to do is get to a point where we can actually negotiate something here that, as I say, is fair and establishes safe protocols for the level of lead, people's blood in the soil, in the air, on the streets, underground, etc. And when I say underground, you've alluded to it. Is it 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot? Is it affected by when we do sewer? I mean, I'm a builder, so I dig under the ground all the time. I run into stuff that probably, given the circumstances and the logistics of calling in for sampling of the materials I encounter, I would just as soon rebury as fast as possible as I would get somebody to come and look at it, because it's so cumbersome to get it remediated. It doesn't happen fast. And so I'm just trying to get to a point where we could get this thing negotiated fairly. And I mean, I had proposed to Brian at BP that, that BP establish a trust fund, an endowment, and that fund, in conjunction with a VCUP over the course of 20 years and mutual releases of liability, et cetera, and a continuation of keeping bad soils at their pits and providing clean soils could be achieved. I'm just looking for a way to get to that point and make sure it gets funded in perpetuity for the town.
Have they rejected that or?
Yes, they basically laughed and said, no, that's not something we're interested in doing. Brian basically told Nicole and I that that's not something they're interested in doing, and we're not interested in funding anything that might be relative to your future utility plans, etc. And that went so far as to say even what she had suggested, which was very simple, which is drainage in town. Our streets don't have drainage. So when it rains, it pours, and where it goes downhill, whether it's lead or whatever. As Pat said, all our streets were bedded and made with tailings, crusher fines. So, you know, I mean, we're getting kind of mixed messages here. And I don't know how to go about doing it. I could see the whole process that people have talked about going through circular petition. I can understand that. I really can. I could see people wanting to get on board with that to get the thing moving. But as far as dealing with BP, I don't know how to go about it other than just getting to a point where you're dealing with somebody who can actually make a decision. And I don't know, I'm asking for help, and I'm not commenting, just looking for a way to get through it.
And I think we talk about going backwards. So say if we were to move forward and agree upon all this, and maybe it takes 5 years, 10 years to clean it all up. And what happens in 15 years when it's decided that what we were left with, what we agreed with, what we released the PRP with is still, for lack of better terms, making our kids stupid or possibly killing us with cancer, you know, the ones who stick around long enough. You know, is that actually going backwards when it might need to be done all again? It's like we're doing it now. I think, you know, we're just trying to do it right.
No, I get that. I get that. Joe, just one concern just to keep in mind, if we came in under the removal program, I don't think we would have the authority to make BP set up a trust under our removal authority.
I believe that. I totally understand what you're saying about that in terms of your enforcement ability. I'm asking for, how do we get to the point where we can get them to understand that we need to have a reliable resource that goes forward that can help fund the continuation of the process of cleanup. And cleanup is not just on the surface, as I said, it's underground. We have really old utilities in this town, and they need to be new, and that's a whole different story in terms of our funding needs here. So the way I look at it is, if you had a trust established and you set up a board to administer a trust or an endowment, that the management of that could actually generate revenue and be applied to various funds in town to administer cleanup going forward, to administer future improvements of infrastructure.
Yeah. So just real quick, I mean, my sense of what ARCO is willing to do at this time is to fund the oversight of the program. So as the town incurs costs to oversee the IC program, the RICO soil ordinance, to pay the incremental cost of remediating, or paying the cost of remediating properties and paying incremental costs if people have to go in and excavate through a cap, or putting in a septic system and they have additional costs, or utilities have incremental costs.
You go
that ARCO is willing to pay as you go. We need to figure out the right mechanism. But as I understand it, they understand the need to pay for that program as the town implements it. But I think they are not willing, and I wasn't on that call, Joe, and so I don't know exactly what was said or how it was presented, but my understanding would be that they want this to more match what they might have to do under other programs. And so setting up a trust fund that could be used for lots of different purposes, including soil remediation. That seems, I think, where they're pushing back, but I think they are willing, as I understand it, to set up an appropriate mechanism to fund both the incremental costs of properties that are remediated that then need additional work done because someone's digging a hole or doing something like that, and also the town's costs, and to fund a consultant that the town would oversee to help property owners implement the program. So that's what I think where they're at right now. And I guess the question is what, this has been super helpful. And I know there's a lot of different questions about sampling and other things, and the risk assessment, obviously. So I think we need to figure out what pieces are appropriate and what the town needs and what it thinks it can get.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I mean, just the last thing I'll say, and I've been meaning to ask everybody this, is that, everyone refers to this as ARCO. Well, ARCO was absorbed by BP in a stock swap. And so the ultimate responsibility here is BP, in my understanding. And so they have a public relations issue that they need to deal with. And they also have the need right now, especially now, to get into alternate sources of energy, one being one good one that we have. And so I just look at it and saying, okay, there's ways to present this. How do we present it? Where do we present it? And if we can't have a meeting of the minds, then what's the next step? I mean, is it litigation? Is it a mediator? How does it move forward, Tom?
I think, so in terms of BP and ARCO, ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Company, is a subsidiary of BP. So it's a separate corporate entity that's owned by BP, as I understand it. They're not merged. But regardless, I think you're right. BP is the owner. It is a separate company, but they are related clearly.
They control the board is what they do.
I'm sorry?
They control the board, so they make the decisions. The board of BP is who controls, who really makes the decision for the stockholders. So that's an issue out there, their profitability. And that's all I got to say about it. I'm just trying to get to the end of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just saying from sort of a corporate standpoint, from a legal standpoint, you're right on the control. I mean, I don't know exactly how the board works, but I would anticipate on some level, you're absolutely right. I was just saying from a legal standpoint, it is a separate corporate entity. But in terms of how do we get this forward, I mean, we've been a little bit stalled, obviously, with some of these discussions over the cleanup numbers. I think there's been questions about the sampling that might be needed. We've made a lot of progress on a lot of pieces of this, but we haven't gone back with asks to BP on some of our documents because we didn't know exactly where we were going. And so once we have clear direction, we can work on those documents and try and negotiate what the open points are, see where the differences are, and see if we can come to agreement on where those differences are, trying to narrow them and see if there's things we can't agree on. At that point, there's different leverage points. But I guess I would recommend, assuming that the board would like to move forward with the VCUP, trying to negotiate those points.
Well, and that begs the point of VCUP, because I think most people, as Pat has said, and Barbara as well, that VCUP around here has this, it's perceived to be a proposed way for BP to get out of this thing, to kick the can down the road another 25 years. And so I guess the acronym VCUP is more form over function, is that it could take many forms. It doesn't have to take the form it's been presented in. It could take the form of just an agreement by both parties to do this and do that, is what I'm getting to.
I wanted to make a comment, but Barbara, you'd had your hand up. I didn't want to.
Thank you. one of the things that is concerning to me is that this has been going on for almost 20 years, this VCUP negotiation, back and forth and back and forth. And quite frankly, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, BP has no real reason to push this through. We are just a tiny dot on a net in their whole world. And I think we have to make a lot of noise if we want to see things happen like this. But I would like to ask a question of EPA, because people have always said, well, if we could just get the EPA to come in. And I think that and this may be a misconception on my part, so I beg your pardon if it is, but I just think that with the VCUP, we can kind of incrementally do the cleanup and bring things up to par with the standards that are established. I understand that if EPA comes in and they sample and they test and they do all these things, they take over and they do it and it's done. They don't incrementally go 20 years with you on this cleanup, but I may be wrong.
No, I think you're right about that. If we were to do it under a removal program, it wouldn't be, when a property owner elects to do the cleanup. Now, there could be property owners that didn't want us to, wouldn't want BP where they would deny access. And typically we don't force those issues. We have the authority to do that, but typically if a residential property owner, we would want some sort of notice in the public record so that they can't pass it off to some future property owner, but we would try to be respectful of those property rights. One thing I just wanted to throw out there that I've seen at some other sites, Joe, dealing with sort of the utilities and infrastructure issues, if BP is putting on the table to pay for the incremental increase, that's pretty good. I mean, it's not reasonable to ask them to come in and to rebuild the town's infrastructure, and they're not going to do it. They're just not. And if that's the expectation, you're not going to get that out of them. They're just not going to come in and agree to, rebuild, sewer and water that are aging and need to be replaced for reasons unrelated. Getting them to pay for the increased cost due to the contamination is probably the absolute best you're going to get. And we couldn't get more out of them than that. So I just wanted to say that. The other thing is, one of the ways that I've seen this addressed at other sites is that, in the permitting process, if a property owner comes in and they want to, dig down, then there can be permitting fees that would go to fund the program. And, it could be a way of putting those funds in a trust that could later be used. The other issue is when say you have undeveloped land, say it's ag land or it's ranch land that is not residential, and it's okay the way it is, but if that land use changes, say, someone wants to come in and build a house or housing development or something like that, it needs additional cleanup, because it's not really appropriate for residential development. It's fine for recreational hiking or something, but and a lot of times then the thought is that the property owner or the developer would absorb those costs if they want to change the land use if it was, the cleanup was appropriate at that time, EPA doesn't typically come in and clean up everything to residential. And I just wanted to say these things to kind of give you some limits, some as to what we could do. I mean, we're pretty good. Don't get me wrong. And we have enormous authority, and I'm really proud to work for EPA, but the removal program reduces risk. It doesn't necessarily, come in and take care of, it's not the same as a site that's on the NPL. So the programs have different goals, different functions. And clearly, I think, we're concerned about some of the sampling we've seen. It's a real problem. And we really, think right now the V cup is the closest thing in sight, but we're not going to go away. We want to see some things happen. There's definitely some human health, exposures and some real concerns in the community that, we need to work with you to figure out how to move forward on this. And not for 20 years, this has got to happen.
Mhm.
I have a follow-up question to that. When the town walked away from the V cup, from the original V cup, did the EPA look at all at coming in at that point?
I don't know. I don't have that history. I'm sorry.
Carrie, my recollection is no.
Okay.
Right. I can speak from experience back then from being on the board that it was an option we had discussed, but I don't think the EPA ever got involved. We discussed the possibility of it. And, we proceeded down the route of the V cup 20 years ago, 22 years ago, whatever it was. And so, here we are in 2021, and pretty soon it'll be 2041. And we'll be trying to think about, or our kids will be, what have you, that what did this board do to get this thing done? And so I think, it's the time to do it. Just got to get there. And how we get there, I'm not really sure at this point. I mean, I don't know. I come from a law background, so my instantaneous thought is, okay, well, you sue the big guy and see what you can find. But I don't see that happening at all. I don't think anybody should go there. I just think this V cup's got to take a different form, whatever that may be.
Yeah, and just to clarify real quick in terms of the incremental cleanup, Barbara, that you were speaking of, to frame it for folks, the intent here, if this V cup were to enter in its current form, all developed properties that have elevated lead on them above 1100 residential would be remediated within 1 or 2 years by ARCO. So all properties that are currently being used would be remediated, and if they're commercial, they would be remediated to 1700. ARCO would also remediate the roads, or pay to have the roads remediated when they're above 1700. And of course, those numbers could be revised if we redo the risk assessment. The incremental part is really the idea that open lots, sort of like you were saying, we don't have, I don't think, so much agricultural land, but there are the mining lots, some of the other larger lots, or even smaller lots that aren't currently used, they're vacant. And the incremental part there is the idea that those would be developed, or when they're excavated or developed, that's when the remediation on those properties would occur. And there's been some analysis done on the residual, called the residual risk assessment, that looked at, is there a problem leaving those vacant lots that are not being used unremediated until they get used? And the answer to that risk assessment was no, but it's an acceptable risk.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Where are we?
Where are we? Well, we kind of skipped around a little bit. I'm looking over this series of questions I have. One way or another, most of them have been answered. But if later, if for some reason we were to come up with more questions, would it be possible to follow up with you guys? Not necessarily that you would come back to us, but maybe respond to written questions?
Sure.
Yes, we can do that.
I have
We
one
can
more
also-
question.
Go ahead, Brandy.
And, you know, I thought maybe this might come up as one of our categories of discussion, and it kind of might be going backwards, but it's kind of just back to the basics of the risk in general. You know, what are young families facing? What are people who want to grow a garden in this current soil situation facing? What have we seen historically, not in Rico in particular, but say other contaminated areas? What have they seen and experienced, and have certain areas seen a lot of illnesses or deaths in specific that have kind of been a benchmark like case to set precedents for these risk assessments and blood levels, and that I think that's where a lot of the questions are within the community too. You know, everyone knows that eating lead paint chips as a kid is bad for you, but what does that mean for that kid 20, 40, 50 years down the line?
I think we probably want to get a toxicologist to talk to you about that has the expertise to really, maybe we can arrange a follow-up discussion, really talk more about risk, and maybe that's something that maybe it's either someone from EPA or probably likely the state would be able to provide some more in-depth discussion around that. We don't have any risk assessors.
It probably falls within Doug's idea of a health consult with, you know, ATSDR. That's right up there. That's right in their ballpark.
That's what they do.
That's what they do.
Has there been any documentation in other, I mean, there's a ton of mining towns in this area. Has there been any documentation of like, that you know of, like disease clusters or anything like that that could have been related to lead contaminated soils?
I'm not aware of any, but again, it's not my.
And again, I don't think lead is considered a carcinogen. I'm not a toxicologist, but we did do an arsenic study down in Pueblo associated with the Colorado smelter site a couple of years ago, and you know, there was no correlation. There was no cancer cluster, so to speak, if that's the term you want to use. There was no real correlation between elevated arsenic levels, because there are elevated arsenics not just in the Superfund site down there, but kind of across the community at large. So that sort of thing, I have never seen one that. That's just a really tough correlation to prove with those sorts of studies. So a lot of people find them very unsatisfactory, because you know, they tend to look at all sorts of lifestyle choices that aren't looked at in when developing Superfund cleanup numbers.
So have there been, can you remember any, I know that usually, well, maybe not usually, but often they do blood tests on children. Do you know of any cases in any of these mountain towns where the kids had there was more than one would expect that was not related to like pain in the house?
Yes, most of the mining sites in Colorado that have become national priority list sites go through some blood lead testing, and often the number exceeds the target level. And kind of how EPA does their risk assessment, this is probably getting way into the weeds, but they have a model, and that model has a goal that says less than 5% of the community will have an elevated blood level. And so that number in the past has been 10, and now it's 5 or even less. So that model kind of says the cleanup level is based on that goal of having a less than 5% of the population having that elevated blood lead level, recognizing that there are other sources of lead. So yes, a lot of communities have had numbers that exceed that goal of 5%, and that's part of the Superfund process is that you go through that evaluation, and then you set your cleanup level to achieve that goal, and then you study through continued blood lead testing whether you're achieving that goal or not. And typically what we found at other sites is education is usually the single biggest factor in reducing community blood lead levels. Education with cleanup is even better, as you might, kind of makes sense. So, but that's kind of how it works at the NPL sites is they run the EPA model, pick the cleanup level, and then continue to do blood sampling to see if they are achieving the goal of the cleanup.
Thank you.
Yeah, to answer your question, Brandy, really quickly, and everybody seems to be fairly dismissive of it, but this graduate study from the University of Montana has some well-researched charts relative to levels of lead, zinc, et cetera, how they compare to Butte, Montana in comparison to Montana in general, in comparison to the United States in general. And they're pretty convincing that other than things that are, lead paint, et cetera, but that are individual diseases that have incrementally higher levels of incidence because of lead due to airborne and touch, et cetera. It's not just lead, it's every other metal that comes out of these mining towns. So I'd encourage you to read it, and I've got it if you would like to.
So I have one more question also. Say we continue on with the V Cup as it sits, and at this point, the residents really have no education on this matter other than word on the street, hearsay. The knowledge of our executive sessions. They've not been involved. They don't know. So if we were to carry on with this and they were still unhappy with our negotiations and decided to pursue the citizens petition, which I think could gain a lot of weight very quickly, what would the EPA's responsibility be to respond to that?
To the citizens petition is we would look at the petition and determine if it was eligible to conduct a preliminary assessment. And if we determine that we would, it's really reviewing the existing data to evaluate the next step under CERCLA, which would be, is there another cleanup authority? Is there need to be further study? Is this something that's an emergency we need to do removal actions at, or is it something that looks more like a long-term cleanup? Those are the kind of questions that initial study does. And I don't, the question is too, does that put a little more pressure on BP to, move forward on this site or not? I don't know. It seems like they've offered quite a pretty comprehensive package already.
Yeah, I'll just speculate that one thing the citizen petition might do if the EPA came in and did the first step in the Superfund process, the preliminary assessment. It would get you some of the data, perhaps some of that independent data, perhaps that you're looking for. It wouldn't be a comprehensive data set. It would be, a limited data set. But typically, EPA, the second step after the preliminary assessment would be to go out and collect data, by collecting environmental media, soil, water, and so.
Yeah, during the preliminary assessment, we look at existing data and existing conditions. We could do some limited data collection, likely not at this site.
Could I just put in a comment? How long if we did something like that, how long would it delay the process that we're now involved in? And do we have a fallback if we go forward with the VCAP and things get all out of whack? What do we do? You know, because as I said, you know, they have been willing to pay for a lot of things for 20 years, and it has cost them a lot of money. So, and I don't think the town can be any more complicit in the length of this negotiation than they have been, because, you know, why not? And now if we entered into this agreement, which I don't think is a bad agreement, but what will we do if we got in trouble?
I think that's exactly right, Barbara. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that if the EPA does their cleanup, the town could potentially be liable as a PRP. And I that's just, it's not in the town or the citizens of this town's best interest. And it's our job to educate the citizens of this town that it's not in our best interest to go down that road.
I mean, would that be from a financial standpoint or a health standpoint?
Likely both, but that's a question for the experts in the room.
I guess I would say, you know, what's trouble? Is it that they renege, that they don't do what they've committed to do? Well, then you have, you know, I'm sure there's provisions in the agreement, but, you know, EPA is the safety net, right? So if things, you know, go south or the PRP stops performing or something happens, you know, we're here.
Yeah.
Plus, there's a big incentive for BP to complete this because that's what provides them their liability protection that show that this problem has been resolved.
And they've done it in accordance with the VCUP.
Yeah, I mean, this is a VCUP that's approved by the state agency, right? It's not just a negotiation between the town and ARCO, and they, you know, kind of slip it under the rug in the middle of the night. You know, that's not how this works. I know it might feel that way, but you know, this is an agreement that we are negotiating, but the state is a backstop. And then EPA also, if we end up with a VCUP and it's not implemented the way that it's consistent with the requirements of the VCUP, the protections of the VCUP go away.
Exactly
so
right.
In order to have those protections, this VCUP needs to be implemented consistent with the requirements.
And if I might also comment, you know, we are in a 4-year cycle of one particular party being in charge of the government now, and the EPA having more heft, I feel, than they did a couple of years ago. And so that's one of my my hesitancy about delaying on this is, you know, 3 years from now, you guys could be kicked to the curb. Like, you know, I'm sorry to say that, but it's pretty much the truth.
No comment.
What I would comment on that, because I know you guys can't, is that some of the programs at EPA are much more political than others, like air quality and water quality. I think Superfund, certainly I'm not denying that there's differences and all that, but it seems like it's a little bit less politicized than some of the other programs. But Barbara, you're absolutely right. There are differences, and you know, BP had a lot more influence at EPA a year ago than they do right now.
Mm-hmm.
No question.
Even under the last administration, Superfund was a priority, and there were no, you know, we didn't see funding cuts resulting from it. So I will remain optimistic until I see otherwise.
Good.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Nope. Is that a no? Last chance. All right, well, so I want to thank you all a lot. Again, it's been really, really helpful. I hope everybody got what the information they were expecting and wanted out of this. And if we have any kind of follow-up questions, it would be great if we could come back to you.
Yeah, if you could just reach out to me and I can coordinate that with the EPA.
Okay.
That'd be great. And, you know, I appreciate your time tonight. And these are difficult issues. So you guys are really taking it seriously. I can see that and really trying to understand them. And I really respect you for that.
Yeah, these kind of leadership roles, you know, decisions you're making for, you know, for your neighbors, it's really quite inspiring and rather daunting.
Just like to say that we appreciate your time. 9 o'clock on a Thursday isn't too convenient. And so just thanks to our guests from the EPA and CDPHE, because this was really informative and I feel productive generally.
And I would like to comment again, and thank you so much for being here, and just stress the point that, you know, we are a small community and we rely on one another, and trust is a big thing here. So we have a lot at stake as individuals who live in this community and as public servants to lead our community in the right direction. And we are trying very hard to be very diligent about that, because when you live like we do and everybody's your friend and everybody has connections with somebody else, we really need to be extremely diligent in our decision.
I understand that perfectly. I've worked in a lot of small towns and it's a different.
It is a different dynamic.
Yep.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking. Absolutely.
Well, again, thank you so much. And Barbara, do you want to make a motion to go out of executive session and adjourn?
I would make a motion to go out of executive session and adjourn. Is there a second?
I will second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Yeah, me too.
Can I vote?
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Good
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.